you. Welcome, Dave and Jessica. I'm Cindy Thiemann, as Alex and Chuck have alluded to, I'm the coordinator for the watershed group. And I wanted to share a little bit about Dave Peterson and Jessica Halofsky, our presenters this evening. Dave is professor of forest biology at the University of Washington, as well as a senior research scientist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. He has conducted research on climate change and fire science throughout the Western United States and has published 250 scientific articles and 4 books on these topics, which I have to say is incredibly impressive, and we're thrilled to have this kind of knowledge, available to us tonight. He was a contributing author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and lead author for the Forest chapter of the recent National Climate Assessment. He currently works on climate change assessments and adaptation on federal lands in the Western United States. And to top it all off, he also lives in Skagit County, where he manages Mountain Heart Tree Farm. So pretty well-rounded forest person, Dave. Jessica Halofsky and Jessica, am I saying your last name correctly? Okay, great. Is the director of the USDA Northwest Climate Hub and the Forest Service Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center. Her research interests include fire and disturbance ecology, vegetation dynamics, and climate change. Jessica has pioneered one of the first climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation projects with the Olympic National Forest and Park. And since that initial project, Jessica has co-led 8 other sub-regional to regional scale climate change vulnerability assessments and adaptation projects around the Western US. We are really honored and delighted to have you both present to us tonight. So thank you to both of you.
Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen, and Dave and I are doing a bit of a tag team here, so I'm going to let Dave lead off.
Yes, thank you, Cindy, for that nice introduction tonight. We appreciate that folks will take the time to listen once again about climate change. We realize you've heard an awful lot about this topic over the last 20 years or so, and we're not going to spend too much time tonight on talking about climatology. We're going to talk a lot about natural resources. And so like Jessica said, we're going to do a tag team, and so we're going to go back and forth here a couple times. And I'd like to second Cindy's comment about putting questions or comments in the chat box as we go through this. And if they start to build up too much, we can certainly take a short break and respond to some of those questions as they come up. If not, we can just yard them up at the end too. But we really will appreciate that dialogue a lot. And please feel free to be creative and ask whatever you'd like this evening. We hope this will be informational and maybe spark some ideas.
Dave, you just went on mute.
Okay, I just unmuted. So hopefully we're good now. So let's go right to the next slide, and we'll give you a little overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. And we might have a little bit of a lag here because we're using a couple different computers. First of all, we're going to focus on climate change effects on forest ecosystems. That's the topic that Jessica and I probably know the most about professionally. And so we're going to spend a fair amount of time on that. But then we're also going to get into other natural resources, particularly for North Central Oregon. We've been very fortunate to spend a considerable amount of time doing an assessment and developing adaptation options for national forests and other lands in that region. So we hope that will be relevant for the Hood River Watershed Group and other participants this evening. And we're going to spend an awful lot of time on responses to climate change or adaptation. There's so much information that's available on climate change and not nearly enough on how to respond to it. So we'll talk about adaptation to both forest ecosystems and for other natural resources. So with that very brief overview, I would like to start with just a little bit of an icebreaker here. And you see some photos here of some dead and dying western red cedars that I photographed here in Northwest Washington. So I'd like to ask the group here this evening if any of you have seen similar kinds of scenes in forests where you live over the last 5 years or so. And you can just put a yes in the chat box or raise your hand or however you want to indicate that. I'd like to see how many people have seen similar things. I see lots of yeses coming up. Thank you. Okay, well that doesn't surprise me because this phenomenon of tree dieback and mortality was quite widespread in Western Washington since about 2015. And I think it really got people's attention, not just forest scientists, but the general public who started seeing dead trees showing up in places where they hadn't really seen this before. And if we go to the next slide, I think we'll get a little bit of a clue as to why this was happening. All right, so here is a slice of data from what's called the U.S. Drought Monitor. And I really invite folks to take a look at this if you want to keep up with the topic of drought. This is an Oregon map for August 2015. We find that it's often instructive to take a look at some of our kind of extreme events. And 2015 was, in fact, a record drought year for much of the Pacific Northwest. And we can see that most of Oregon here is in that nice red color. So 2015 was a kickoff year for an extended drought period that occurred between 2015 and 2020, especially between the years 2015 and 2018. And so if we go to the next slide, we get a little bit more information, and we see that we had 6 consecutive warm summers. Those summers were also dry. Now, we always have dry summers in the Pacific Northwest, even on the west side, but these were exceptionally dry summers. And this is what causes stress for trees in our forest ecosystems, even on the west side. So this is really quite an exceptional period of time, and we feel that this was probably the primary cause that we were seeing so many dead and dying trees. Now, it didn't kill all the trees, obviously. In some cases, it may have killed trees that were in stressful situations otherwise. They were in crowded stands, they were near roads, or had some other issue going on. But it was a bottleneck through which the trees had to pass, and some of them didn't pass the test. Next. So, question is often asked of Jessica and myself, well, how do we expect trees to grow in this warmer climate that we're entering? And so I'll give you just a short summary here. And almost everything I'm going to say is backed by a lot of scientific literature and data. So these aren't just my opinions, but they're very well backed by scientific information. First of all, we take a look at sort of our iconic low elevation west side forest, species like Douglas fir, western hemlock, western red cedar, Sitka spruce, and some of our wetter sites. As we just alluded to, these species are all moisture limited in summer because we have dry summers. It almost doesn't matter how wet the winter is at low elevation, because by the time we get to summer, the soils dry down and there's moisture limitations. So we expect that all these species will have decreased growth as the climate continues to warm over the next several decades. That doesn't mean they're going to die, but they will be less productive. Now we go over to the east side of the Cascades, where it's clear that we're already in a moisture limiting situation, much less precipitation, and very hot and dry summers. So these are species that are already tolerant of drought, but they still will be stressed in an increasingly warmer and drier environment. So ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, western larch, some of the iconic species on the east side will almost certainly decrease in growth. let's go up to higher elevation forests now. I'm sure a lot of you spend time hiking up around Mount Hood and other high elevation areas. I know that's my favorite place to go. And we have a very different situation here ecologically. So species like subalpine fir, mountain hemlock, lodgepole pine, these are species that are not typically moisture limited, but are energy limited. And when I say energy, I mean basically heat and sun. So if you're under snow for a good portion of the year, clearly you can't grow at all. So the more days you have without snow covering the ground, the more days you can potentially grow. So we expect that with a warmer climate and less snowpack, that a lot of these species, a lot of these trees will actually increase in growth in the future. And I think this underlines the point that there are both winners and losers in the climate change game. And that we tend to think that climate change will have all negative consequences, but there may be some positive consequences for some species. And it also depends on what your values are for what is positive or negative. Anyway, high elevation trees might be winners. Now, another kind of system I'm actually quite concerned about are those that are water controlled. So our riparian areas, wetlands, groundwater dependent systems, they're all obviously affected completely by the amount of water that's present on an annual basis. So some of our very special habitats are bogs and fens, all these places that really enhance biodiversity, even if they comprise only a small portion of it, could be increasingly stressed in the future. We might get some changes in species composition.
So just sign one per box. It's a lot.
And maybe not so much on the west side, but on the east side, we're concerned that some of our riparian areas that have been able to avoid fire for centuries, perhaps, may now be more susceptible. That would really change things quite a bit. Now, all of the things I just mentioned, I think, are very important. But our biggest challenge is going to be extreme events. So rare but extreme droughts, big fires, insects, all these kinds of things will really be our biggest challenge in terms of what will change ecosystems in the future. Okay, mountain pine beetle, I'm guessing a lot of you have heard about mountain pine beetle. Its favorite food is lodgepole pine. It also likes ponderosa pine. Since about 1990, temperatures have warmed enough that this insect has been able to greatly increase its reproductive rate. It's not killed over the winter as it has been in the past, and it's expanded its geographic range both altitudinally and latitudinally to the north. So this is a species that's on the move. It's kind of like a poster child for climate change. In fact, since 1990, mountain pine beetle has created outbreaks across 50 million acres of land in the Pacific Northwest, the interior West, and especially into British Columbia and parts of Alberta. So 50 million acres is a lot of territory. This is an unprecedented kind of event, at least during our recollection of history and insect attacks and so forth. And it was completely facilitated by temperature as well as forest being in a low vigor state, often in high density. Okay, so now we move to fire, and I'm sure that's a topic that's on everyone's mind, even a couple months after the fires have occurred in Oregon. And this is a map that's basically a statistical projection of future fire in the western United States. And it shows what we expect could occur with about a 2-degree warming, which isn't really that much. That's probably around mid-century, 2050 or so. And I don't place a lot of stock in the differential colors exactly on this map, but if you want to just take one thing home from this map, think of the area burned in the future around mid-century being about 2 to 3 times higher than it has been historically. So instead of having 5 to 6 million acres per year, you might end up having you know, 10, 15, 20, excuse me, 15 to 20 million acres per year in the West. And that really is kind of a game changer in terms of effects on ecosystems, as well as social and economic effects on organizations and communities. And another thing we like to look at increasingly now is this interaction of disturbances. So this is just a brief animation that shows how wildfire and insects and disease have occurred across the greater Pacific Northwest since 1997. And so just be patient if you can while the colors appear on the screen, and you'll start to see the orange blobs and the brown blobs get bigger. You'll see them start to meet each other at their borders, and you'll see these different patches start to coalesce over time. Okay, so that's just a 20-year time series that we looked at, and that covered a huge portion of this particular map. And we expect that in the future, as the temperature gets warmer, that will continue to increase. And so this really is having a large effect rather quickly, even today. Now, here's just a quick bit of data from the 2020 fires. This was truly an epic year in Oregon and California in particular, somewhat less in Washington, but also attention getting, to say the least. And these West Side fires that occurred this past year in Oregon were truly historical. These are the kinds of things that would happen maybe once every 250 to 300 years historically. And I know that people tend not to think about fire on the west side of the Cascade. But when we get these anomalous east wind situations where we have the warm, very dry winds coming over from the east side, that's a key element in creating these big fires. You know, the Beachy Creek fire, I think, spread 130,000 acres in one day. That's some pretty amazing fire behavior. It's important, I think, to disentangle this anomalous weather event from climate change per se. It's very difficult to say whether a particular fire event or a particular year has been affected by climate change. It may or may not, almost certainly will be in the future. But this kind of event could perhaps happen more frequently in the future if we have warmer days in the late spring to early summer and in the late summer to early fall. So we'd be creating the conditions in which fires could occur, but we don't expect these east winds to necessarily change associated with climate change. And again, just showing you the Oregon map from the U.S. Drought Monitor during the middle of September, and you can see why these fires were so intense and why they persisted. Very significant drought, some of the worst drought in the United States was occurring in Oregon during this period of time. So this is what we think is a pretty clear cause-effect relationship. So just to sum up what we've talked about so far, we expect that in most of our forests, we will probably have lower growth associated with higher temperatures, with the exception of some of our high elevation forests. We expect that there might be higher mortality from biotic disturbances, including insects and fire, both of which could be facilitated by drought. We expect that there will be more fires, larger fires, and more area burned. One thing we didn't really talk about, but I think we need to mention, is that in this higher disturbance future, we can also expect non-native species to be more successful. Some of our subalpine forests could be vulnerable, especially if fire gets into them. They are not as well adapted to fire as low elevation forests. And overall, this increasing disturbance scenario of the future will probably mean somewhat less dominance by conifers and somewhat greater dominance by younger forests across the landscape at large.
All right, I think I take over from here. So I wanted to tell you about a project that Dave mentioned that was a climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation project with the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, and the Mount Hood and Willamette National Forests. So we called it the CMW project for short, since this is a bit of a mouthful. The project objectives were to try to synthesize the best available scientific information to identify key vulnerabilities to climate change. We focused on the federal lands, but a lot of the analysis and synthesis we did is applicable to all lands in this region. We wanted to use the vulnerability assessment information to set the stage for development of adaptation strategies and tactics, and also wanted to develop other tools to help resource managers incorporate climate change into their management. So this was the general approach we used for the project. So we did call this a science management partnership. And this was a partnership between Forest Service, Research and Development, and other scientists at other agencies and universities, and then the managers on those 3 units that we mentioned, along with a number of other different partners. And we established teams to conduct the vulnerability assessment over a period of about a year. And then we held an in-person workshop where we had scientists present the vulnerability assessment information, and then we had managers take the lead on identifying adaptation strategies and tactics. And we're currently working on publication of a report based on this work, which will be published through the Pacific Northwest Research Station. So this is a multi-resource assessment. So we had a chapter on climate, the future climate projections, temperature, precipitation, changes in growing season. Then we had a chapter for each of these other resource areas. So it covered water resources, changes in stream flow, and potential effects on water uses and infrastructure. We had an assessment covering a number of different fish species and how their habitat might change. We had a chapter covering vegetation change and changes in fire and other disturbances. I had a wildlife chapter focused on a number of different focal habitats in the region and how those might change. And then we also covered recreation, a number of different recreation types and how those might be affected. And then a chapter on other ecosystem services. So that included carbon, pollination, water quality, and cultural heritage. I'll tell you a little bit more about how the project worked. Again, we had a science team for each of those different chapters that I just mentioned. And those teams took the lead on doing analysis, synthesizing data and other information, and took the lead on the writing of the chapters. We had program managers for the Forest Service Pacific Northwest region that helped provide guidance and interpretation. And then we had specialists from the forest units who provided data, had local interpretation. And again, they took the lead on developing those adaptation strategies and tactics, which we'll get into more here in a little bit. So again, we had a 2-day in-person workshop in Salem, and we the first day was focused on presenting the vulnerability assessment for each of those different resource areas. And then we got feedback from managers, and there were close to 100 people there, between people from the units and various partners. And then the second day was focused on the what do you do about it part. So managers developing ways to reduce negative effects of climate change, take advantage of any potential benefits, and then also develop ways to help ecosystems transition to new conditions. This was a timeline for our project. So it took place over about 2 years. So for about the first year was when we're in a data collection, synthesis, analysis phase. And then the workshop was conducted in the spring of 2019. And then we've been working to finalize all the reports, and we do conduct external technical peer review and incorporate those reviews, and then are working on publishing the general technical report. which we hope to have out in an in-press version very soon. So Dave has covered some of the expected changes in forests around the region. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about some of the other resource areas that were included in the assessment. So starting with the hydrology chapter, there was analysis that looked at the expected changes in snowpack. And so these figures show snow water equivalent, which is a measure of snowpack on the left-hand pane, and then snow residence time, or how long we expect snow to persist on the ground on the right-hand side. And these are projections for the 2080s, so the end of the century. You can see in a lot of places where we currently have snow, we're expecting pretty substantial declines in snowpack. There is more persistence at those highest elevations. And then we're also expecting the number of days that snow persists on the ground to decrease quite substantially, in some cases by as much as 83 days in a year. And with these warming temperatures, we're also expecting glaciers to continue to shrink. So we did get some analysis from a group at Portland State University. And so you can see here we have the glacial extent in kind of the lighter blue color in 2016. And then, I'm sorry, the light blue is 2016. The more purple color, it was the extent in 1907. So you can see the glaciers have already shrunk quite a bit, and we're expecting that to continue into the future with warming temperatures. Now these effects on snowpack are also going to affect stream flow. And so when we have less snowpack, more precipitation falling as rain rather than snow, and when we have the snowpack that does exist melting earlier in the season, then we have a water running off earlier in the season, which leaves less water for later in the summer. And so in a number of places where stream flow is affected by that snow melt, we're expecting lower summer low flows. You can see that's particularly evident at the higher elevations on the eastern side of the study area and around Mount Hood, where in some cases in these kind of orange and red colors, we're expecting between about 50 and 80% reduction in stream flows in the summer by the end of the century. Now, at the same time, when we have less water being held as snow, more intense rainfall events, we're expecting that flooding could also increase in the future. And so we're expecting increased winter peak flows. And again, those are more evident in places that are affected by snowpack. And so again, particularly in those higher elevations on the eastern side of the study area, where we could see up to a 40% increase in the streamful or bankful flow in the winter. And we know when we have roads that are close to these streams, they're likely to be flooded over and over again. So we did an analysis that looks at all of the roads that are within 300 feet of a stream, and looked at the analysis of how the stream flow is likely to change. And we identified here in the red and orange colors on the left where we're expecting the roads to be at risk from floods. And you can see there are quite a few, especially around Mount Hood, and again in those higher elevation areas. And then we also looked at how snow persistence was likely to change and how that overlaid with the road network, because we're expecting that if the snow is not lasting as long, then a lot of these roads that have historically been covered by snow in the winter are all of a sudden going to be free of snow for most of the year. And that's a risk to the roads and the Forest Service, because if people are accessing those roads in the winter when they're more likely to see things like landslides, when the roads are really wet, it could damage the roads and it can also put people at risk. So you can see again at in those higher elevation areas around Mount Hood, we're expecting there to be a lot less snow cover on the roads in the winter. Maybe that's a good thing too. You can have more access for recreation in the winter that we didn't have before. But when we have both increased air temperatures and lower summer stream flows, we expect that combination to lead to increased stream temperatures. And so these this is a look at stream temperature historically on the left, and then at the end of the century around 2080 on the right. And you can see there are some locations, particularly the Columbia River, where we expect stream temperatures to be quite a bit higher in the future. And this can be stressful to our cold water adapted fish species, and including all of our salmon and in this example, bull trout. So in this example, we have the historical habitat for bull trout on the left, and you can see the stream temperatures, or the colors indicate the stream temperatures historically. And then we can look at what that will likely be in the future. So we can determine where the habitat will likely exist in the future, and where there are places where habitat is not going to be so good for bull trout in the future, where it currently is, and then places where that habitat will remain. And so that can really help prioritize stream restoration in the future to make sure we maintain those cold water habitats where we can for particular species. So as I mentioned, there was also an analysis of some key habitat types for wildlife species. And so this is an example for the subalpine habitat areas. So there's an evaluation of the current habitat features and of existing stressors, and then what we might expect to happen with this habitat in the future. And so we expect this habitat type to have significant losses of snow, potentially increased drought stress. We expect that tree species might invade some of the meadow habitats, and that these are also recreation hotspots, which can be an additional stressor to some wildlife species. And really some of these animals are going to be able to move in response to climate change. But when we're talking about subalpine habitats, there really isn't a lot of area for species to move upward in elevation. And so they're really going to have to rely on what we call refugia, or areas that continue to have those habitat characteristics that they depend on. And there was an analysis for a number of different types of recreation, including warm weather recreation. So this includes hiking, biking, camping, driving for pleasure. There was an analysis of what proportion of recreation is made up by these activities. So you can see for Mount Hood, it's about 1/3 of all recreation. And so warm weather recreation is going to be, of course, affected by increased temperatures. We expect the shoulder season, so the fall and the spring season, to be extended because of higher temperatures. So more opportunities for recreation there, more overall warm weather activities. There's some question as to whether the actual overnight use might increase in those shoulder seasons. People generally aren't on vacation during those shoulder seasons, so they might not have the ability to go camping overnight. But we do think at least the day use would increase. But a couple of caveats on that. One, this summer was, well, actually this fall was a good example of how smoke can really inhibit recreation in this category. So we expect overall, with those caveats, there'd be a moderate increase in warm weather activities. But of course, the Eagle Creek fires are a good example of how fire events, extreme events, can affect recreation. This fire was many years ago, but there are still quite a few recreation areas that are not open. So the red dots or the red squares with the little hiking person were still closed as of the winter of 2019. And I think we'll see this with the recent fire events too, that it's going to take a while for a lot of our recreation areas to open again. All right, moving on to snow-based recreation, what is included there. So this is about half of all recreation on the Mount Hood National Forest. Of course, increased temperatures, as we just talked about, are going to reduce our snowpack, the later snowfall, an overall shortened snow season. And we're probably going to see a lot of those low elevation ski areas close and maybe not be available at all as we get later into the century. So we're expecting snow-based recreation to be highly affected by climate change. And there was an analysis done, again, looking at that snow residence time information and how this overlapped with some of our ski areas in the region. And so you can see places like Hoodoo are going to be in areas where we're expecting a pretty substantial reduction in snow residence time. And so the skiing might not be great in Hoodoo as often into the future. Or as we get into our high elevation areas, and they're a little safer as far as snow in the future. And a note that, as Dave mentioned, we had that the winter of 2015, or the year without snow, and you can see the annual visits to a lot of ski areas declined substantially that year because we just didn't have the snowpack to support skiing. Mount Bachelor was the exception. It's high enough in elevation that it's able to maintain snow and ski conditions and still have visitors. So we will publish the assessment information again as a Forest Service General Technical Report. We've done a number of these vulnerability assessments for subregions around Oregon and Washington. And so those are all available online, and we can share the website with you here, and I'll put it in the chat as well. And this, for this particular project I was just talking about, you can find information here, and when we do have the final report available, it will be at this website. So if you just go to adaptationpartners.org, you can look at the different projects and this one in particular. And I'll turn it back over to Dave now. Oops.
Okay, so you've had a pretty good overview of some of the things that we can expect in the Pacific Northwest in general, especially for forest ecosystems, and a really good detailed overview there by Jessica on the broader effects on natural resources in north central Oregon. So really some significant things to think about in terms of water, recreation, vegetation, and so forth. I know it sounds kind of gloom and doom, so I want to transition here to maybe a little bit more hopeful topic in terms of what we can do about it. I've been hearing more about terms such as climate change fatigue and eco-anxiety, and I wasn't sure what to think about these for a while, but I'm realizing they are real things and might be especially prominent in younger people. So I think it's really important to always include some hopefulness and some ideas that will inspire creativity and action in the future. And that's the sense for the rest of this presentation today, is that I think there are a lot of things that we can do about climate change now, both on public lands and private lands. And I want to put in a bid for private lands. As was mentioned earlier, I am a tree farmer, and we do manage forest up here in Northwest Washington, so I take this very personally, and I really want to make sure that some of the things that we use in our assessments with national forests and national parks are also applicable for small forest landowners and industrial forest landowners throughout the Northwest. So we'll launch into this and we'll cover a number of different topics rather quickly here, but I hope that some of these will resonate with you, both as users of public lands and perhaps as if some of you are managers of lands as well. So the regeneration phase of the forest ecosystem life cycle is the key place where disturbance is going to determine who wins and who loses in a warmer climate. There's a lot of competition out there after a big fire or after an insect outbreak. You can see the density of the seedlings there in the upper photo. And in the bottom photo, you can see how exposed those young seedlings are to the environment. There's a lot of variation in temperature at the soil surface. It gets really hot during the day. It may be particularly cold at night. The root systems are still quite small, so they're very sensitive to periods of low moisture in the summer, and they're extremely sensitive to drought. So this is really going to be the big bottleneck that our native species will have to pass through in order to survive a warmer climate. I will mention a number of things here that I call good practices. These are things that we can do to encourage basically a reduction in some of the negative consequences of climate change, as well as to transition our ecosystems and our management organizations to a warmer climate. So first of all, we just need to take care of our seedlings. You know, again, whether this is on public land or private land, if we're planting seedlings or if they have regenerated naturally, we want to make sure they have enough moisture to get through those dry summers. So if we're planting seedlings, we might do something like make sure they have a little bit more mulch around their base, as shown in the upper photo there. That's not something we're generally not going to carry tons of mulch out into the field with us, but we might be able to kick up some of the organic matter that's nearby. And we need to protect our trees from the other stresses that occur. So all of our deer like to munch on tree seedlings, especially western red cedar, but they'll take anything that's out there. So we need to make sure that these other stressors aren't inordinately negative problem for the seedlings. We also want to have some awareness about which species are appropriate and where and when we plant them. So there's this old saying that's used a lot in teaching private forest landowners, and that is to plant the right tree in the right place for the right reason. And so I think, although that's rather simplistic, it's always good advice. So some of our tree species in the Northwest that are particularly drought tolerant include Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and grand fir. And Douglas fir, I don't know if that surprises you or not, but there's a lot of Douglas fir on the east side that occurs in fairly dry environments. Grand fir is very common on the east side, not quite as common on the west side, but it's one of those species that we're encouraging landowners to think about a little bit more in the future, particularly if you're underplanting. It's a shade-tolerant species, but it's also relatively drought-tolerant. So we want to keep this in mind as to what our likely successful species will be. Now, diversity is almost always our friend when it comes to preparing for climate change. So we can talk here about species diversity, and we can talk about structural diversity. So rather than having all of our trees arranged in rows, same height, same species, same age, and so forth, we feel like mixing this up a little bit in terms of the structural characteristics of our forest stands at a large scale could be quite beneficial. The reason here is that if there is some particular disease or if there is a drought-affected syndrome that goes around, that maybe one type of species would be affected, or maybe one age class might be affected, but you won't lose all of them. The key here is to retain some biodiversity across the landscape. So this diversity seems to be a way to basically expand our portfolio and not put all our eggs in one basket. Here's an interesting topic that has come up fairly recently, I'd say within the last decade or so. And that's the idea of being more flexible with what are called seed zones. Now, this is a map of seed zones for Douglas fir in the state of Oregon. The concept here is that you should plant tree seedlings that were propagated from the seed zone in which you live. So if you live in the Willamette Valley, then you should probably be planting tree seedlings that were propagated from seeds or from germplasm from those particular trees. This is something that was based on good science, and we've been doing for probably 40 or 50 years, and now we're saying, well, let's rethink this a bit. A good example of how science can change over time. And there's a discussion that's ongoing right now about possibly mixing up the genotypes a little bit. So if you live in the Willamette Valley, you might plant some trees that were propagated there, but also some trees from a zone that's farther south. The logic being that those trees from farther south may be more tolerant of higher temperatures in the future. Now, we don't have a framework for doing this yet. There's no recipe. We don't have long-term trials that can tell you what the outcome is. But I do recommend nowadays to other forest landowners that they think about this and think about this as part of the diversification process genetically across the landscape. We'll be hearing much more about this in future years. Another question we get quite a bit is, should I be planting trees from other locations farther south? So should I be planting giant sequoia? Should I be planting redwood, white fir, and so forth? And this concept is known as assisted migration or managed relocation. And again, the logic is that those tree species from farther south would be more adapted to a warmer climate. My advice at the current time is I think I wouldn't rush this too much. Now, I'd never discourage landowners and forest managers from doing some experimentation. But if you're going to plant 100 acres, I wouldn't make it all giant sequoia or coast redwood. Maybe you want to plant a couple acres in those species. But I would say stick to your local species, but maybe modify the genetic composition of them to a certain extent. We'll be hearing more about this in future years as well, and a lot of how we address this topic will depend on how quickly climate change may accelerate problems with some of our locally native species. So stay tuned for more information on this. But I would say be fairly cautious and conservative about planting new species wholesale. Now, the best practice we can do as landowners, either with private lands or public land managers, is just keep forests healthy. You know, we need to really be assertive about managing stand density. I know that sometimes harvesting trees makes people queasy, but if we don't keep the trees healthy, if we get too many straws trying to drink the same amount of water out of that glass, the trees are going to be more susceptible to insects and disease in the future. And we don't do a whole lot of fuel control or fuel modification on the west side. That's more of an east side practice, but it's something we may think about around residences and high value areas. So managing forest density and fuels needs to be done at large scales if you're going to do it. If you do it at a small scale, it really doesn't make much of an impact. We really have to do this collaboratively across different land ownerships, going across boundaries to really be effective with this practice. So we're going to switch now to Jessica, and she's going to follow up on some of the resource areas you talked about in the climate change assessment.
Great, thanks, Dave. So these were some of the adaptation strategies and tactics that were developed by land managers at the workshops we talked about. And so for each, I'm going to go through a key vulnerability. In this case, as I mentioned before, we're expecting higher winter peak flows in the fall and winter, and then more flooding to occur. And so a general strategy to address that is to try to design infrastructure that's more resilient to those increased peak flows. And specifically, things you can do on the ground would be to install larger culverts that can accommodate larger flows. Trying to maybe think about roads that are in those floodplains and getting rid of some of those roads or moving them. And I also have to think about where campgrounds are located, because there may be instances where, you know, everybody likes to camp along the stream, but some of those campgrounds might be subject to repeated flooding in the future and make them very hard to maintain. In the area of fisheries, again, we expect the stream temperatures to be higher, and that's going to make it stressful for our cold water adapted fish species. And so a general strategy is to try to maintain that cold water habitat. And the first step in that is to know where the habitat is, but we can also think about restoration practices that can help maintain that habitat. So thinking about making sure floodplains are connected, trying to increase overall hydrologic function. And then we know the riparian areas are really important in providing shade to streams and keeping the temperature down. So it's important to restore and maintain that riparian vegetation. For wildlife, we know that more disturbance could lead to a loss of habitat in some cases. And so we really want to try to increase the resilience of habitat, particularly our late successional old growth habitat that a lot of species depend on. And so some tactics around that would be to try to protect and maintain and also develop more legacy structures. And what I mean by that is our large trees, our snags, and our down wood that are key habitat features for a lot of species. In the area of summer recreation, we know when it's hot out, we like to go recreate in streams and water. And so there's going to be an increase in demand for this kind of recreation. But with lower stream flows and more drought, we might have a decrease in the number of suitable sites for water-based recreation. And so a general strategy is, you know, from an agency perspective, is to try to increase the flexibility in how water-based recreation is managed and how particular sites are managed and facilities are designed. And some tactics might be, you might have to make the boat ramps longer so they actually reach the water when the water levels are low. We might have to manage capacity at some sites. Some sites might not be able to accommodate all of the people that want to use them. And we might have to think about what the public expectations are around recreation when we have low water levels and higher levels of use in particular places. So I wanted to note that all of the adaptation strategies and tactics that have been developed at our workshops around the West are in a tool we call the Climate Change Adaptation Library. This has close to 900 different adaptation strategies and tactics. And we did just redesign the site so it's all searchable. You can look at different resource areas, and it give you some ideas of what's been developed for different resource areas and what might be applicable for other situations. And so they're, again, in all these different resource areas that we've talked about tonight. So overall, Dave, do you want to give this one?
I can, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So by now, I hope you have the impression that we have a lot of options. There are lots of things that we can do out there. And also, I want to emphasize that a lot of the topics that Jessica and I talked about in terms of climate change adaptation are things that we're already doing in the name of sustainable resource management. So this does not necessarily mean a complete change in how we go about managing natural resources. It might mean a fine-tuning. It might mean changing our priorities about when, where, and how we do certain types of things. But I really feel confident that our resource managers have the skills and experience to implement these kinds of changes. So a key thing here is thinking about the future when we're doing planning and management now, and thinking about 30 years plus from now when we plant that tree, when we put in a new culvert, that sort of thing. Diversification, again, I really want to emphasize, I think that's always going to be a go-to paradigm for us in the future, whether we're talking about species diversity, genetic diversity, spatial and functional diversity. These will all give us additional options in a warmer world with more disturbances. When these disturbances occur, I really like to think of them as an opportunity for doing some different things. Maybe we can change the trajectory of that particular ecosystem in a way that's favorable in a warmer climate. Maybe we can do some experiments that are a little bit different than what we've done in the past. You know, our tendency is that whenever a fire occurs or an insect outbreak occurs, that it's a disaster. And then we spend several years trying to staff out what it is we're going to do about it. We need to have those plans ready now, because it's not a matter of if these things will occur, but it's a matter of when they'll occur. So we need to be prepared. I think it will also be useful if we implement the concepts of risk assessment and risk management with climate change. I mean, we already do this in resource management. We're always thinking about what's the probability of fire here, or what's the probability of a flood or an insect outbreak and so forth. And so now we just need to add climate change into that mix of things that we consider. And we need to monitor what the effectiveness is of the things that we're doing relative to climate change. We need to learn from what our management effectiveness is doing out in the field, and also then we need to adjust as needed. An additional part of that is we need to share this information as broadly as we can. So one national forest should be sharing that with another national forest, with a national park, with a private landowner, so we have broad landscapes that are being managed in a way that's climate smart. So we'll end the presentation there. We have our email addresses listed there at the bottom. Please feel free to send us an email in the future if you want to discuss this presentation or anything else in the future related to climate change, forest management, and so forth. And it looks like we have some comments in the chat box, so maybe we can get into some of those now.
I'll go ahead and read off, sort of starting from the first question from Michael Krochta. Since the collaborative group regularly provides recommendations on Forest Service projects, do you have any examples of how we might expect the agency to be using this information on a project level? And any ideas for how we can encourage or help them do that?
Well, that's a great question. And I'll say up front that I think on public lands and private lands, we've been slow on the implementation phase. And we have 30 years of science on climate change. That's a lot of information. And with the assessments that Jessica and I and some other folks have been doing, we've been pulling together a lot of information that making that available. But the actual implementation of climate change adaptations have been a little bit slow in coming, but they are coming. I think we have good examples, particularly in fisheries right now, where there's some great work going on with riparian restoration, stream restoration, reconnecting streams, reintroduction of beavers to maintain water, and so forth. Also in the area of infrastructure and roads and engineering, our engineers on the National Forest are some of the best climate change adapters out there, in my opinion. And they know exactly what to do with a future that tells them we're going to have more floods. You make the culverts bigger, you re-engineer the roads as appropriate, and you remove some of the roads that might be problematic in the future, and so forth. So I think that the key is to make sure that the entire resource staff at the forest is aware of this kind of information and these kinds of adaptation options that are available. When you work in your collaborative activities, bring these topics up, remind them. Nowadays, in the Forest Service at least, there is a requirement that climate change be considered in all planning activities, and that should then drill down into projects on the ground. So if you don't consider them, you might be missing some important information. And I think that's that's kind of the gentle way to bring that topic up with folks. If they haven't thought about it, it doesn't mean they're not smart people. They just may not have, they may not be aware that certain types of information are available. Jessica, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that covered it.
I do think you'll see a lot more progress in that area in the future in the Forest Service, and I'll just say, especially in the next 4 years, and leave it at that.
This is a question from Ron Martin. He's asking about what can be done to mitigate low flows anticipated in the summer, and that this can be a big problem for agriculture. And Ron, I'll just say that that is actually a really big area of activity for the watershed group and all of our partners, the Soil and Water Conservation District, the irrigation districts that are in the Hood River watershed and elsewhere, and water conservation at the, particularly in agriculture, has been really extensive, delivery system conservation projects so that water's not being lost via the delivery system. So I will say that from our side of things, but Jessica and Dave, you might have a different perspective on that from the Forest Service side of things.
Yeah, I know that I think conservation is a great one. I know some farmers are experimenting with dry farming techniques that require less water for irrigation. But I think it was also mentioned too that the climate change all-stars beaver reintroduction and maintaining beaver does help store water on the landscape because it slows water down. So that can be helpful, and any practice that helps to increase stream function. Again, reconnecting floodplains, decreasing incising and channelization to slow down the flow of water, restoring riparian habitat, that can all help keep water on the landscape for a longer period of time.
And I'd like to second what Cindy had mentioned there about getting different groups to talk about this issue. I mean, when you're talking about water rights, you get into some pretty sticky issues. And you're talking about people's livelihoods and economics and so forth. We have found in some cases around the West that there are communities where there are a whole bunch of people who have a stake in water, from skiing to municipal use of water and to agriculture. And if they're willing to stretch and have good conversations with one another, quite often they can come to some agreement on adaptation options that would be mutually beneficial. And I think there's, to be honest about it, the agricultural community has been more conservative about climate change and doing something about climate change, but I believe we're seeing that change now as we see effects occur more often and more broadly. And I'm just cautiously optimistic that the more we have those conversations, the more we'll be able to develop solutions.
Yep, and I'll, Brenna did a shout out for beaver population increases and the work that BARC's doing in the Clackamas watershed. Jessica seconded your suggestion there, Brenna. And a question from Courtney about whether there will be more information about impacts to drinking water resulting from hydrologic changes. Was that part of what you guys looked into at all?
It was, yeah. So we had several examples of potential effects on municipal watersheds. So we had people from City of Portland and Bull Run watershed managers involved in the assessment. And so there will be a highlight box on Bull Run watershed and also City of Eugene. And so that is incorporated there. Of course, fire is a big fear related to water and burning of the watersheds. And it's been very well illustrated in the last 5 years. We've had some close calls with Bull Run and some other areas. So that continues to be a big climate change concern. They have a lot of studies going on around those municipal watersheds and potential risk of fire and any potential ways to mitigate the risk of fire. But again, the west side isn't typically do large scale fuel rejection treatments, because if fires occur under those really extreme conditions, it's pretty unlikely that fuel treatments would affect fire behavior. So it's difficult to determine what can be done to really protect watersheds from those kind of fire events.
Glenn Aaron asks, Dave, if you were looking at 100 acres of west side Douglas fir hemlock that just burned, how would you approach replanting mixing species, mixing seed zones of Douglas fir? And Dave, or Glenn, I'm sure we can't imagine where you're talking about.
Thank you for that question, Glenn. It's a wonderful question, and I think there are many possible answers to it. So I guess what I would do first of all is to see what the soils are like on this particular location and see how the soils might affect the soil moisture situation in the long term at this site, especially in a warmer climate. So that would be number one. Douglas fir would probably be our go-to species here, in all honesty. So I would probably emphasize that in planting. Western hemlock will usually establish itself without too much trouble, but if we feel like there's some problems with seed source, we could consider planting western hemlock, as well as our other more water-hungry species like western red cedar, but plant it in the right microsite in these locations, perhaps next to a stream in a riparian area and so forth. We don't want to exclude these other kinds of species that provide diversity. I would also think about maybe a little grand fir in there, and also hardwood species where they're appropriate, again, probably in our riparian areas, if planting is necessary. Sometimes they will sprout just fine after a fire. In terms of the genetic characteristics, and this is just kind of seat of the pants, but I would say for Douglas fir, maybe about 50% from the local seed zone and 25% from each of two more southerly seed zones, just to mix it up. And how you do that spatially, I'm not sure. I would tend to just mix them all up as opposed to planting them in blocks. We could also consider some different patterns out there of how we plant these species. You know, again, not in rows of equal densities everywhere, but maybe mix up the densities a little bit, again, to provide some of that structural diversity.
Okay, another question from Brenna, or a question from Brenna for Jessica. Will there be more formal presentation or workshops for the climate vulnerability assessment, similar to the one you recently facilitated for the coastal forests?
Yeah, we just did a similar assessment for the Sayusla National Forest and BLM lands, and just had a webinar on that. Unfortunately, the one for the Columbia River Gorge, Mount Hood, and Willamette, that webinar took place last year. Unfortunately, the recording did not work for that one, so I can't share it with you. But I will promise that the actual report is going to be out soon enough. You can go to that adaptationpartners.org website and find it there, and you'll be able to access all of the information. And you know, we can potentially do more rollout webinars once the assessment is finished, or some public meetings related to that too.
You know, one thing that you folks can do in the watershed group and other groups you belong to is to encourage the National Forest to do these kinds of rollouts once these publications are available, or to convene public meetings, something that Jessica and I have done, not just with the National Forest, but also with local communities and towns where there is a good critical mass of people who are interested in this topic. If you can get those kinds of public meetings where you have local folks show up as well as some of the folks from National Forest, you can really have some good interaction and really come to some common understandings on different topics. So don't be shy about encouraging that sort of thing.
We won't. Dale had a question regarding impacts of harvesting activities on carbon releases, sequestration potentials, and possible reductions in more costly management practices. Those topics have not been addressed in the presentation tonight. more and more research tends to link these issues with improved possibilities in ecosystem services, particularly in carbon release impacts. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I can start, and maybe you want to follow up on this, Jessica. This is a big topic that has a lot of different aspects to it, and you really have, sometimes the devil is in the details in terms of what an appropriate response is. But the most important thing in my mind is to keep forest land as forest land. So that's, you know, might be more challenging in the future. So we want, maybe that will mean a little bit of a change in the genetic diversity or maybe even species in the future. But keeping forests as forests to the greatest extent on both public and private lands is the best way to sequester carbon in these ecosystems, as well as to return carbon to the soil. So that's one kind of straightforward general sort of thing. This issue of thinning forests often comes up, and people see that any harvest of a tree is a loss of carbon going up into the air, and I don't look at it that way, because if we don't keep forests in high productivity, vigorous state, they're likely to succumb to drought, to insects, possibly to fire, and so forth. So it's a trade-off of having, you know, a maximum amount of carbon versus enough carbon and enough trees on the landscape to survive in the long term. We don't always know exactly what that number of trees is, but we would like to have good coverage of forest in most of our landscapes. Now that may also mean not just old forests, but also some young forests, which provide diversity, which take up carbon dioxide at higher rates than old forests. So again, this concept of diversity has to be integrated rather than having just a blanket approach to how we do forest management across millions of acres. I'm not sure if that answered your question. Maybe you can pick out another aspect of that, Jessica.
I think that was well said, Dick.
Okay.
So Jessica posted the link to the Adaptations website there in the chat box, and we will also have that in the minutes to this meeting if you miss it in the chat box. If anybody has a question that they would like to just say, and you don't need to type in the chat box, feel free to unmute yourself and ask other questions. All right, well, I've got a question for you guys. So do you talked about changes, increased growth to for higher elevation forests. And I'm wondering if there's any research or whether you have an opinion on whether we might see greater, you know, an actual increase in the elevation of timberline in our area. Mount Hood is famous for debris flows and sort of barren slopes up in the, you know, upper, 4,000 feet of the mountain. And do you think we'll start to see the forest creep up and potentially even stabilize some of the slopes higher up on a mountain?
Well, that's a great question. And the ecology of subalpine forests has been one of my research specialties for about 25 years. So I love talking about this topic. We have a lot of scientific information on some areas in the Pacific Northwest, including Mount Hood. And what we've found so far is that at tree line itself, the very upper end of where these trees can survive, we don't see a lot of change, at least not yet. What we do see is that the slightly lower elevations in kind of that parkland habitat where you have clumps of trees and openings and so forth, that a lot of those openings are filling in with tree seedlings. And that's happening throughout the Cascades, from northern Washington down to southern Oregon, and we have good data on that. So clearly, during this period of warmer climate, lower snowpack, this creates the conditions that allows these trees to fill in. There is evidence at Glacier National Park of this upper tree line change, and I expect we might see it in the Cascades as well. But regeneration is a very slow process for these trees. And also at tree lines, sometimes the soil is so poor and retains so little soil moisture. It's just a very tough challenge for species to get, for some of these seedlings to get established. But, you know, maybe by the end of the century, I would be very surprised if we didn't see something happening in terms of tree line rising a bit.
Robert Roth, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. What I'm concerned about is, you know, we've had major fires in the Clackamas Basin, particularly the Riverside Fire. And how do we make sure that the fire recovery planning and implementation fully takes into account the projected climate change trends?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I know we're rushing a little bit to get this report out the door because we're hoping that, that it can help inform the forests and other landowners in thinking about climate change in the future, and then and how they design restoration and planting. So I know the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station is planning to work with the regions to help them prioritize and decide how the planting will be conducted, and in helping them think about their post-fire restoration activities as well.
You know, a real challenge with some of this post-fire restoration is actually just getting enough tree seedlings to plant. You know, we haven't really been designing our tree nurseries to provide millions of trees at a time to respond to enormous fires. So it's a tough situation. We've already faced some of this on the east side, and I suspect we might now be facing some of it on the west side of Oregon as well. I hope that we can ramp up the production of the nursery stock quickly, and we'll see how that plays out in the next few years.
Susan Hess has a question now.
One of the problems I understand, you know, with tree coverage is, you know, just increasing populations, and we're going more and more, I guess, diversified, not diversified, but I guess expanding clearing, you know, either for agriculture or for rural residentials, and as well as just the sort of as densifying cities, then there's less and less tree coverage within the city, and then as the cities grow, then that also takes on. Did your studies take any of that into account, that population connection with forestry?
Yeah, that came up a lot in, you know, particularly thinking about habitat and how increased development affects wildlife habitat and how connected it is, and how that affects how species may or may not be able to respond because they don't have that connected habitat that they used to. And of course, it came up a lot in regards to water and water availability, for water quality around the region, and in thinking about ecosystem services and how those will be maintained into the future.
Yeah, another area where that's come up recently too is in fire, maybe more on the east side than west side, but I think we're thinking more about wildland urban interface issues now on the west side as well. You know, everybody knows that the cost of fire management has increased dramatically in the last 20 years. You know, to the extent that the U.S. Forest Service now spends something like 57% of its entire budget on fire management. A big chunk of that goes to fire suppression. And the biggest cause for the increase in fire suppression costs has been the increase in the area of the wildland urban interface. It's simply much more expensive to put fires out around cities and towns than it is in wildland areas. And it's also much more expensive to do fuel treatments in and around towns and populated areas. So this is having a very direct feedback on the whole social economic context for fire management and future wildfires. I think in terms of solutions, you know, I always encourage people to run for county commissioner or get on a planning board or do something where you can affect land use, because that's what this is all about. And counties have every motivation to put in as many houses and businesses as they can because it generates tax revenue. But they never consider deeply enough the social costs and economic costs of doing that. They rely on the federal government to cover up, put the fires out, and provide emergency funding. I know that sounds rather crass, but I've seen this happen my entire professional life, and that's at least part of the reason we're in the situation we are now with fire and other resource crises.
Great point there. Question from Courtney. Will the increase of fire area burned in the future, 2 to 3 times current average, as you referenced in your talk, will that provide sufficient young forest, assuming they're all replanted, for beneficial carbon sequestration?
Well, I guess we hope so. You know, this assumes that all those forests that burn can, in fact, regenerate with or without human assistance. We won't be storing as much carbon, but we'll continue to take up carbon. As I said earlier, I think a key factor here is to keep forests on those landscapes if we possibly can, one way or another, and to just stay on top of things. I think it will be certainly, 100 years from now, I think our forest landscapes will look quite different. There'll be more younger trees out there, but hopefully there will be trees and not just shrubs and grasslands. Anything you wanted to add to that, Jessica?
Nope, I think that covers it.
On that same topic, in your report, do you talk about you talk about human management in relation to fire? Because I think a lot of us know that a lot of ignition sources come from humans, whether it's power lines that spark, or campfires that aren't getting put out. Definitely in this, this summer, there were a lot of ignition sources. I might be wrong. I think it's in the Riverside fire where there were just Labor Day weekend campfires that didn't get put out. Do you guys talk about that in your adaptation report?
There's not much on that in the actual report at this point, but I know that the Pacific Northwest Research Station is conducting a research initiative focused on West Side Fire, and I know human ignition sources is definitely something that they're looking at, and how those patterns have played out historically, and thinking about how that might change in the future and how that might affect fire risk on the west side. So that is work that's just getting started, but definitely an important topic.
Yeah,
it's an interesting.
Jessica very accurately summarized that. I think for the future, we might look south to California. I know we don't always like to do that, but in this case, the vast majority of fires that occur in California are human caused, and they are now in the business of shutting down, power lines and so forth to prevent fire ignitions and doing some other things related to that. So there might be a few ideas down there that would help us take a look at that, as well as taking a look at possibly strategies that are being considered by the insurance industry to try to both reduce ignitions as well as to ensure that we have fire-safe communities. Regardless of what happens with the ignitions part, whether or not we can affect that, we can do things that will make where we live more fire-safe and more resilient to a future with more fire.
Yes, we have an interesting relationship with campfires. I think we humans. This past summer, we did a little bit of camping, and we're camped at a lake in the South Sisters, and a party next to us started a campfire that evening. And I was really sure that I'd seen a sign that said no fires. This was at the beginning of August, and it was below timberline, but I was pretty sure I'd seen that sign. And so afterwards, I went to my I looked it up on the Deschutes National Forest website, and yes, there had been in fact a ban on fires since the end of June. And what I found interesting was the tone of the, you know, sort of the message from the Deschutes National Forest, almost apologetic, that they, you know, they said, we're not trying to ruin anybody's fun. We're just trying to, you know, keep things safe. So it just spoke to me about this deep part of many people's psyche that needs to have a campfire in order to feel like they're camping or out in the woods. I just think it's a community conversation that we should continue to have.
That's a good point, Cindy, I think at this point, I see no more questions. And it's also about time for us to stop the presentation. We are going to have our meeting, but